The flames were still eating the side of my house when Karen stood across the street, with her arms crossed, like she was watching a bonfire she paid for. "You should have joined the HOA," she shouted over the crackling wood. "This wouldn't have happened." Smoke rolled into the dark sky. My porch collapsed with a loud crash. Neighbors stood on their lawns holding phones, whispering to each other. The fire trucks had just arrived, but the fire had already taken half the house. I stood there in the dirt driveway, ash falling around me. My daughter was holding my hand so tight it almost hurt. "Daddy, our house," she whispered. I squeezed her hand gently. "It's okay." But it wasn't okay, not even close. Karen walked a little closer to the police officer, who had just stepped out of his car. She pointed directly at me, like she had been waiting for this moment all day. "That's him," she said loudly. "He's been breaking HOA rules for months." The officer looked confused and glanced at the burning house behind me. "Ma'am, his house is on fire." Karen nodded like that somehow proved her point. "Exactly," she said. "He refused to follow community regulations. I warned him many times." My neighbor Mike stepped closer to me and whispered under his breath, "Did she just blame you for your own house burning?" I didn't answer, because I was watching Karen very carefully. Her face wasn't shocked. It wasn't sad. It wasn't even angry. She looked satisfied. That's when the firefighter captain walked over to the officer. "We're going to need to ask some questions," the captain said. The officer nodded and turned to me. "Sir, where were you when the fire started?" Before I could answer, Karen jumped in again. "He probably started it himself for insurance money," she said. A few neighbors gasped. My daughter looked up at me, confused and scared. I crouched slightly so I could look her in the eyes. "Stay with Mr. Mike for a minute, okay?" She nodded slowly and walked toward him. Karen smirked when she saw that. "Oh good," she said. "Maybe Child Services should take a look at this situation too." That was the moment the officer finally looked annoyed. "Ma'am," he said, "you need to calm down." But Karen wasn't done. She pulled a folder out of her purse and waved it in the air like it was some kind of trophy. "I'm the HOA president," she announced, loudly so everyone on the street could hear. "And this man has refused to sign the HOA agreement since the day he moved in." I folded my arms. "That's because this property isn't part of your HOA." Karen laughed. A loud, mocking laugh. "Oh really?" she said. "Then explain this." She pulled out a paper and handed it to the officer. "It's the official HOA violation notice I gave him yesterday." The officer looked at the paper while the fire roared behind us. Mike leaned toward me again. "You didn't sign that thing, right?" "No," I said calmly. Karen clapped her hands once like a teacher scolding a student. "Exactly," she said. "He refused. So according to HOA policy, enforcement actions were approved." The officer frowned. "What kind of enforcement actions?" Karen smiled slightly. "Oh, property compliance measures." The firefighter captain suddenly walked back toward us holding something in his hand. "Something small, something metal." "Officer," he said quietly. Everyone went silent. He held the object up. It was a small gasoline can lid. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You found this inside the house?" The captain nodded. "Near the back door." The crowd started murmuring. Karen's smile faded for half a second, but then she quickly pointed at me again. "See?" she said quickly. "Arson. I told you he probably did it himself." The officer turned slowly toward me. "Sir, do you own a gasoline can?" Before I could answer, Mike suddenly spoke up. "Yeah," he said loudly. Everyone looked at him. Mike pointed across the street, at her house. Karen's head snapped toward him. "What?" Mike crossed his arms. "I saw you this afternoon, Karen," he said, walking around the back of his house. Karen laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "That's ridiculous." Another neighbor raised her phone. "I recorded it," she said. Karen's smile disappeared completely. "You what?" The officer turned toward the neighbor. "Ma'am, can I see that video?" Karen's voice got louder instantly. "That's illegal. You can't record HOA officials during enforcement." But the officer had already taken the phone. The video started playing. Everyone leaned closer. The screen clearly showed Karen walking along the side of my house, holding something in her hand, a small red gasoline can. The crowd went dead silent. Karen stepped back. "That's not what it looks like," she said quickly. The officer paused the video. Then he looked at her. "Ma'am, why were you carrying gasoline around someone else's house?" Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time that night, she looked nervous, but then she straightened her shoulders like she had just remembered something. "Oh please," she said. "Even if I was there, that property still belongs under HOA authority." She turned toward me with a cold smile. "And you refuse to cooperate." I looked at the burning remains of my house for a moment. The roof finally collapsed with a loud crash. Ash floated through the air. Then I slowly turned back to Karen. "You really think this street belongs to you?" I said quietly. Karen lifted her chin. "It does." I nodded once. Then I pulled a small black folder out of my truck. The same folder I had been carrying all evening. The officer noticed immediately. "Sir." "What's that?" Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh great. More excuses." I opened the folder calmly and handed the top document to the officer. He looked down at it. Then his eyes widened slightly. "Wait." Karen frowned. "What?" The officer looked back up at me. "Sir, this says the land dispute case for this entire HOA goes to court tomorrow morning." Karen laughed again. "Exactly," she said. "And we're going to win." But the officer kept reading. Then he looked at Karen slowly. "You might want to read the next line." Karen grabbed the paper from his hand. Her eyes scanned the page. Her confident expression slowly faded. "What?" She flipped to the second page. Her hands started shaking. "That's not possible." The officer spoke quietly. "Ma'am, according to this document." He paused. "The judge assigned to that case." Karen slowly looked up at me. Her face had turned completely pale, because she had just read the name printed at the bottom of the page. And at that exact moment I said the one sentence that made the entire street go silent. "I guess I'll see you in court tomorrow morning." Karen whispered one word. "You." I closed the folder calmly. "Yeah," I said. "I'm the judge." Karen just stood there staring at me like the ground had disappeared under her feet. The fire trucks were still spraying water on what used to be my living room. But suddenly nobody on the street was looking at the fire anymore. Every phone camera slowly turned toward Karen. "You," she said again, her voice barely coming out. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile either. "I'll see you in court tomorrow morning," I repeated calmly. The police officer looked from me to Karen, then back to the document in his hand. "Sir, are you saying you're Judge Daniel Carter?" I nodded once. Karen suddenly let out a sharp laugh. A desperate laugh. "Oh please," she said loudly. "You expect us to believe that? A judge living in this old place?" She pointed at the burned house like it proved something. Mike crossed his arms beside me. "Karen, you might want to stop talking." But Karen was already digging through her purse again. "This is ridiculous," she said. "HOA presidents deal with people like this all the time. Fake stories, fake documents." She pulled out her phone and started tapping the screen quickly. "Let's just settle this right now." The officer watched quietly. Karen turned the phone around and shoved it toward him. "Look him up," she said confidently. The officer took the phone and typed the name into the search bar. The screen loaded for a moment. Then a photo appeared. My photo, wearing the black robe, standing behind the bench in the county courthouse. The officer slowly looked up at me again. "Well," he said quietly, "that answers that." The crowd around us started whispering louder. Karen's face turned stiff. She snatched the phone back and stared at the screen like it had betrayed her. "That doesn't mean anything," she muttered. "Judges can't be involved in cases like this." She looked up at me again, trying to regain control. "You're just trying to scare me." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I tried to ignore this for months." The firefighter captain walked past us carrying more equipment, but even he slowed down when he heard that. Karen scoffed. "Oh really? Then why didn't you say anything before?" I pointed calmly at the burned house behind me. "Because I thought people would stop before it went this far." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "we need to talk about that gasoline can." Karen instantly snapped back to her old tone. "You're seriously accusing me of arson now?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the neighbor who recorded the video. "Mom, could you send that footage to the station?" "Already uploading," she said. Karen's jaw tightened. "That proves nothing," she snapped. "I was performing HOA inspection duties." Mike laughed out loud. "With gasoline?" Karen ignored him and turned back to the officer. "You should be questioning him," she said, pointing at me again. "He's been illegally living here for 6 months without HOA approval." The officer rubbed his forehead. "Ma'am, you do realize judges own property too, right?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. For a moment she looked like she was trying to rebuild the story in her head. Then suddenly she straightened up again. "You know what?" she said loudly. "Fine." She pointed at the burned house. "Maybe someone set a fire. Maybe not. But that doesn't change the fact that this property is inside HOA boundaries." The officer slowly turned toward me. "Sir, is that true?" I leaned against my truck calmly. "No," I said. Karen snapped her fingers like she had just caught me lying. "Yes, it is." The HOA map clearly was altered. The street went silent again. Karen blinked. "What?" I opened the black folder again and pulled out another paper. A large printed map. I held it out for the officer. "This is the original county zoning map from 1994, I said. The officer studied it. Then he looked across the street, then back at the map. His eyebrows slowly lifted. Karen shifted nervously. "What does that prove?" The officer pointed to the map. "Ma'am, this entire street is HOA property." He moved his finger slightly to the left. "Except for this one lot." Everyone followed his finger. "Right to my property." Karen's face froze. That's wrong," she said quickly. I shook my head. "No." I tapped the paper once. "My grandfather bought this land before the HOA even existed." The crowd started whispering again. Karen looked like she was struggling to breathe. "That's impossible," she said. I calmly pulled out one last document, the original deed, signed in 1972. The officer looked at it, then let out a low whistle. "Well," he said. Karen grabbed the paper and scanned it desperately. Her hands started shaking again. This doesn't change anything," she said weakly. Mike stepped closer. "Actually, Karen, it changes everything." Karen suddenly pointed at me again, her voice rising. "You planned this." I tilted my head slightly. "Planned what?" "This," she shouted, pointing at the burnt house. "You set this up to trap me." The officer's voice became firm. "Ma'am, that's enough." Karen spun toward him. "You're making a huge mistake." But at that moment, another police car turned onto the street. Then another. 3 cars rolled slowly toward the house. Karen frowned. "What is this?" The first car stopped near the driveway. 2 detectives stepped out. They looked around at the burned house, the firefighters, the crowd, and finally at me. One of them nodded slightly. Then he turned toward Karen. "Karen Mitchell?" he asked. Karen lifted her chin again. "Yes." The detective held up a tablet. "We received a call about possible arson." Karen pointed at me immediately. "Good. Arrest him." But the detective didn't move. Instead, he turned the tablet around. It showed the same neighbor's video, but zoomed in. Clearer, much clearer. You could see Karen pouring gasoline along the back wall of my house. The detective looked her directly in the eyes. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "would you like to explain this?" Karen's mouth opened slowly, but this time, no words came out. Karen's mouth stayed open, but no sound came out. For the first time since she stepped onto my property months ago, the woman who never stopped talking suddenly had nothing to say. The detective waited. The whole street waited. Even the firefighters had slowed down, watching from the edge of the yard. Karen finally forced out a shaky laugh. That video is edited." The detective didn't react. "It was recorded from 3 different phones," he said calmly. Karen blinked. "What?" He tapped the screen again and turned it slightly so the officer beside him could see. 3 neighbors recorded you from 3 angles." The officer let out a low breath. Karen's shoulders stiffened. "That still doesn't prove anything," she said quickly. "I was checking the property line. Mike couldn't hold it in anymore." "Karen," he said loudly, "you poured gasoline on the wall." Karen spun toward him. "You stay out of this." But Mike didn't move. "You threatened this guy for months," he said. Everyone here heard it. A woman down the street spoke up. "She told him last week she would make sure that house disappeared." Another neighbor nodded. "I heard that too." Karen turned in a slow circle, realizing the crowd wasn't on her side anymore. Her eyes landed on me again. "You did this," she said quietly. I didn't respond. The detective stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us." Karen laughed again, louder this time. "You're arresting me? Over a video?" "No," the detective said. He pointed at the burned house. "Over arson." Karen took 2 steps back. "You can't arrest the HOA president." The officer beside him shrugged. "Turns out we can." Karen suddenly pointed at me again. "He provoked me," she shouted. He refused to follow the rules. The detective's expression didn't change. Burning someone's house isn't a rule enforcement tool. A few neighbors actually clapped. Karen's face turned red. You people think you've won something tonight, she snapped. Nobody answered. The detective took out a pair of handcuffs. Karen Mitchell, he said calmly, you are under arrest for suspected arson, property destruction, and reckless endangerment. The street went completely quiet. Karen stared at the cuffs like they were a joke. You're serious? The officer stepped closer. Turn around, ma'am. Karen didn't move. She looked at the burning house again, then back at me. Her voice dropped low. This isn't over. I met her eyes. No, I said calmly, it's just starting. The officer gently took her arm. She jerked away. You'll regret this, she shouted. But two detectives were already beside her. The cuffs clicked around her wrists. Several phones lifted higher to capture the moment. Karen noticed. Her voice suddenly changed. You can't record this, she yelled. But the cameras didn't lower. The detective guided her toward the patrol car. She kept looking over her shoulder at me, like she still expected me to panic, or beg, or shout. But I didn't move. Mike stepped closer to me. Man, he whispered, that woman really burned your house. I nodded slowly. Yeah. The fire captain walked over and removed his helmet. We've got the flames contained, he said, but the structure's gone. I looked at what was left of the place my daughter Anne I had lived in for 6 months. Black beams, collapsed walls, ash floating in the air. My daughter walked back toward me and grabbed my hand again. Daddy, where are we going to sleep? I knelt down beside her. At a hotel tonight, I said softly. She looked back at the house. Karen did that. I nodded once. She thought about that for a moment. Then she asked something that made Mike quietly look away. Is she going to jail? The detectives were just putting Karen into the patrol car, and the question reached her. She froze halfway inside the back seat. No, she snapped. I'm not. The door shut. The car pulled away. The street stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then the murmuring started again. Mike rubbed the back of his neck. Well, tomorrow's court hearing is going to be interesting. I looked down the row, where the patrol cars had disappeared. Yeah, I said. Very interesting. The firefighters continued cleaning up while the police collected statements from the neighbors. Almost everyone had something to say. About Karen, about the HOA, about the threats she had been making. Apparently I wasn't the only one she had bullied. I just happened to be the one she went too far with. About an hour later the street slowly returned to normal. The fire trucks left. Most of the neighbors went back inside. Mike stayed with me near the driveway. You know something, he said. What? I think Karen believed she owned this whole street. She did, I replied. Mike frowned. What do you mean? I leaned against my truck. The HOA board changed the property map 2 years ago. Mike blinked. Wait, they what? They expanded the boundary lines, without permission. I nodded. Mike let out a long whistle. That's illegal. Yes. Mike looked toward Karen's empty house across the street. So tomorrow's case isn't just about my property. Mike shook his head slowly. That woman really picked the wrong guy. I didn't answer, because something else had been bothering me all night. Something that didn't quite fit. The detective from earlier walked back toward us holding a small evidence bag. Inside it was the gasoline can lid. Judge Carter, he said. Off duty tonight, I replied. He nodded slightly. Fair enough. He held up the bag. We found this inside the back hallway. I studied it for a moment. Is that the only piece? No, he said. We found the can outside the fence. Mike frowned. Outside the fence? The detective nodded. Hidden in the bushes. I straightened slightly. Hidden? Yeah. Mike looked confused. Why would Karen hide it? The detective shrugged. That's the strange part. He pulled out his tablet again and showed us another clip from the neighbor's footage. Karen was walking along the side of my house holding the gasoline can. But then something happened near the fence. She suddenly looked over her shoulder, like someone startled her. The video cut off there. Mike leaned closer. Wait. Go back. The detective replayed the clip. Karen paused near the fence again. Then she quickly shoved something into the bushes. The can. But right before she moved away, another shadow crossed the camera. Someone else was standing near the trees. Mike blinked. Hold on. The detective zoomed the video. The shadow wasn't clear, but you could see a second person standing near the fence line, watching Karen. Mike looked at me slowly. You expecting anyone tonight? I shook my head. The detective scratched his chin. That's what we're trying to figure out. Did anyone else report seeing someone? I asked. Not yet. Mike stared at the screen. Could be a neighbor. Maybe, the detective said. But there's another problem. What? I asked. He tapped the screen again. The video jumped forward 30 seconds. Karen had already left the side of the house. Then suddenly flames appeared from the back wall. Mike frowned. Wait, she didn't light it. The detective nodded slowly. That's exactly the problem. Karen poured gasoline, but the fire started after she walked away, which meant only one thing. Someone else lit it. Mike looked at me. So, Karen didn't actually start the fire. I crossed my arms. She still tried. The detective nodded. True. He looked back at the video. But someone finished it. The wind blew ash across the driveway while we all stared at the screen. Mike finally spoke. You think someone helped her? The detective shook his head. Or someone used her. That idea hung in the air for a moment. Karen was cruel, arrogant, obsessed with control. But she wasn't careful. Someone smarter could have easily taken advantage of that. Mike looked across the street at Karen's dark house. You think someone from the HOA board did it? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the burned remains of my house, then at the fence where the shadow had appeared, then at the empty road leading out of the neighborhood. Maybe, I said quietly. The detective slipped the tablet back into his jacket. We're going to check nearby security cameras. Mike nodded. Good idea. The detective started walking toward his car, then stopped. One more thing, he said. What's that? I asked. He looked straight at me. You might want to be careful tomorrow. Mike frowned. Why? The detective pointed at the burned house. Someone clearly wanted this property gone. A cold breeze passed through the street. Mike looked uneasy now, but the HOA already lost. Maybe, the detective said, but people who commit arson don't usually stop after one try. With that, he got into his car and drove away. Mike stared down the road. Well, he said slowly, that's comforting. I looked at my daughter sitting on the tailgate of the truck. She was drawing shapes in the dust with a stick, completely unaware that something bigger might be happening. Mike followed my gaze. You thinking what I'm thinking? Yes. This wasn't just Karen. No. I said. He rubbed his chin. So tomorrow's court case just became a lot more dangerous. Mike sighed. Man, I thought this was just some HOA drama. I gave a small smile. So did Karen. We stood there quietly for another minute. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. Unknown number. I answered it. Hello. The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. Judge Carter. My eyes narrowed slightly. Who is this? The voice ignored the question. You shouldn't have come back to this property. Mike noticed my expression. What's wrong? Keith whispered. I raised a finger slightly for him to wait. The voice continued. Karen was supposed to scare you. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Who is this? I repeated. The voice finally answered. Someone who owns far more land here than you realize. My grip on the phone tightened. Then why burn my house? There was a short pause. Then the voice said something that made my blood run cold. Because that house was sitting on something we need. The line went dead. Mike stared at me. What did they say? I slowly lowered the phone. Karen wasn't the real problem. Mike blinked. Then who is? I looked toward the black ashes where my house used to stand. Someone who thinks my land belongs to them. Mike shook his head. This HOA story just turned into something else. Yeah. I said quietly. Much bigger. My daughter walked over again and grabbed my hand. Daddy? Yad. She pointed toward the empty road at the end of the street. A black SUV had just stopped there. The headlights were off, but the engine was running. Mike squinted. You know them? I stared at the vehicle for a long moment. No. The driver's door slowly opened. A tall man stepped out. Suit, tied, polished shoes. Not exactly the kind of person who shows up at a burned house in the middle of the night. He started walking toward us. Mike whispered under his breath. Okay. That's creepy. The man stopped a few feet away. His eyes moved from the ashes to me, then to my daughter. Finally he spoke. Judge Carter. I didn't respond. He adjusted his jacket calmly. My name is Richard Halbrook. Mike frowned. And you are? The man smiled slightly. I represent the company that owns the land under this neighborhood. The words hung in the air. Mike looked confused. Wait, what? I stared directly at him. That's impossible. Halbrook's smile widened. Is it? He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document. Then he handed it to me. Take a look. I unfolded the paper slowly. Mike leaned over my shoulder, and then both of us froze, because the document showed a massive development contract, signed 6 months ago, for this entire neighborhood. Mike's voice dropped. They sold the land. Halbrook nodded calmly. The HOA board did. I felt a tight pressure in my chest. They can't sell private property. Normally no, Halbrook said, but they believed your lot belonged to them. Mike looked at the ashes again. Oh man. Halbrook clasped his hands behind his back. You see the problem now, Judge. I folded the document carefully. Your company tried to erase the one property you couldn't legally touch. Halbrook didn't deny it. Instead he glanced at the burned house again. Unfortunately, things became messy. Mike scoffed. You burned his house. Halbrook raised a finger. Let's not jump to conclusions. I stepped forward slightly. You called me tonight. His smile faded for the first time. So you know that voice? I do. For a moment the man said nothing. Then he sighed. Well, that saves time. Mike looked between us. You two know each other. I answered without looking away from Halbrook. He was the lawyer representing the HOA in tomorrow's case. Mike's jaw dropped. You're kidding. Halbrook adjusted his tie again. Now you understand why this situation is complicated. I folded the document and handed it back to him. You burned the wrong house. Halbrook tilted his head slightly. Did we? I looked straight into his eyes. Tomorrow morning, you're going to find out. For the first time that night, Richard Halbrook didn't smile. Richard Halbrook didn't smile. For a moment the man just stood there looking at the ashes where my house used to be. The wine pushed smoke across the street and the orange glow from the burned beams reflected in his polished shoes. Mike shifted beside me. So let me get this straight, he said slowly. Your company buys land from the HOA. Then this guy's house suddenly burns down the night before court. Halbrook looked at him calmly. You're making assumptions. Mike laughed. Yeah, because it looks pretty clear from here. Halbrook ignored him and focused on me again. Judge Carter, you understand how development works. Sometimes property boundaries create obstacles. I crossed my arms. You mean the one lot you couldn't legally touch? He didn't answer that. Instead he gestured lightly toward the neighborhood. Do you know what this land is worth? Enough for someone to commit arson apparently, Mike said. Halbrook sighed, like he was tired of the conversation. This neighborhood is sitting on a $70 million project. My daughter squeezed my hand again. Daddy, what's 70 million? I knelt down for a moment. It's a big number, I said softly. Then I stood up again and looked at Halbrook. You burned a man's house because your paperwork was wrong. Halbrook shook his head. No, Karen burned your house because she was angry. Mike snorted. Yeah, right. Halbrook's expression stayed calm. She believed your property belonged to the HOA. We simply allowed her to continue believing that. The words hung in the air. Mike stared at him. You used her. Halbrook shrugged slightly. She was very motivated. I felt the slow anger building in my chest. You planned this. Planned is a strong word, Halbrook said. But yes, we knew removing your house would solve the zoning problem. Mike pointed at the ashes. That's arson. Genius. Halbrook smiled faintly again. Prove it. For a moment the street went quiet. Then I spoke. You already proved it. Halbrook frowned slightly. What do you mean? I pulled my phone from my pocket. Remember the call you made earlier? His eyes narrowed. You recorded it. I nodded once. Mike looked impressed. Oh, that's good. Halbrook's calm expression finally cracked a little. That recording proves nothing. Actually, I said, it proves motive. I tapped the screen and held it up. And the detectives already have it. Halbrook didn't move, but I could see the tension in his jaw now. You're bluffing. Right on cue. Two sets of headlights turned onto the street. Police cars. Halbrook slowly turned his head toward them. Mike grinned. Oh look, your friends are back. The cars rolled closer and stopped near the driveway. The same detective from earlier stepped out. He walked toward us while looking directly at Halbrook. Richard Halbrook. Halbrook straightened his jacket again. Detective. You didn't mention you were coming back here tonight, the detective said. I was speaking with Judge Carter. The detective nodded. We know. He pointed toward my phone. That recording was very helpful. Halbrook went completely still. The detective continued. Conspiracy to commit arson, property fraud, and evidence tampering. Mike whispered under his breath. Wow. Halbrook tried one last time. You're making a mistake. The detective shook his head. No. The mistake was thinking burning down a judge's house would go unnoticed. The officers stepped forward. Halbrook looked at me one more time. You think this stops the project? I met his gaze. It stops you. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Mike let out a low whistle. Man, tonight is wild. Halbrook was placed in the back of the patrol car. The detective walked back over to me. Judge Carter, he said, off duty tonight. I replied again. He smiled slightly. Fair enough. Mike looked down the street where the patrol cars drove away again. So tomorrow's court case. Still happening, I said. Mike rubbed his hands together. Oh, I wouldn't miss that for the world. The next morning the courthouse was packed. Word had spread fast. News vans lined the parking lot. Cameras waited outside the courtroom doors. Half the neighborhood had shown up just to watch what would happen. Karen sat at the defense table wearing a wrinkled suit instead of her usual confident smile. She looked smaller now, tired. Across the room another chair sat empty. Richard Halbrook's chair. He wasn't there because he was sitting in a holding cell downstairs. When Karen saw me walk into the courtroom wearing the black robe, she froze again just like the night before. The courtroom stowed. I took my seat behind the bench. Be seated. The room settled slowly. Karen's lawyer leaned toward her and whispered something, but Karen wasn't listening. She was staring straight at me, probably replaying the moment she lit the fuse that destroyed her own life. The prosecutor stood first. Your Honor, this case concerns illegal HOA expansion, fraud, attempted property seizure, and last night's arson incident. Karen suddenly stood up. That fire wasn't my fault. Her lawyer grabbed her sleeve. Sit down. But Karen kept talking. That man refused to follow the rules. The courtroom murmured. I raised my hand once. Ms. Mitchell. She slowly looked up at me. This is not a neighborhood meeting, I said calmly. Her mouth shut instantly. The prosecutor began presenting the evidence. The altered HOA maps, the illegal property expansion documents, the development contract Halbrook signed, the video footage of Karen pouring gasoline, and finally, the phone recording. Halbrook's voice echoed through the courtroom speakers. Karen was supposed to scare you. The room went silent. Karen's face turned pale. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. When the recording ended, the prosecutor spoke again. The defendants believed destroying the only independent property on this street would clear the way for a $70 million development project. Mike was sitting in the back row with the neighbors. He whispered loudly, "Worst real estate plan ever." A few people chuckled. Karen looked like she might collapse. Her lawyer stood slowly. Your Honor, my client was manipulated. The prosecutor nodded slightly. Perhaps. He held up the video again. But she still committed the crime. Karen suddenly slammed her hand on the table. He deserved it. Gasps filled the courtroom. Karen pointed at me. He thought he was better than everyone, living outside the HOA rules like he owned the place. I leaned forward slightly. Ms. Mitchell, her voice trembled now. You made everyone follow your rules except yourself. I spoke calmly. I followed the law. The room stayed quiet. Karen looked around at the people watching her. Neighbors, reporters, police officers, even the firefighters from the night before were sitting near the back. Everyone she used to order around. Now they were watching her answer for what she had done. Her shoulders slowly dropped. The fight drained out of her. Her lawyer sat down. The evidence phase ended. After a long pause I spoke. The court finds the HOA expansion invalid. A quiet wave of whispers moved through the room. The altered property maps are declared fraudulent. More whispers. And the development contract signed under those maps is void. Mike pumped his fist quietly. Yes, I continued. As for the criminal charges, those will proceed separately. Karen looked up slowly. Tears were running down her face now. You're ruining my life. I met her eyes. No. I said calmly, you did that yourself. The courtroom stayed silent. I finished the ruling. This property remains independent and legally protected. Mike leaned toward the neighbor beside him. Told you Karen picked the wrong house. I placed the final paper down. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck once. Just like that, it was over. 2 months later the street looked very different. Karen's house sat empty. A foreclosure notice hung on the door. The HOA board had been dissolved after the fraud investigation, and the development company quietly disappeared after the lawsuits started piling up. Mike walked across the road carrying 2 cups of coffee. You know, he said, handing me one. This neighborhood is way quieter without Karen yelling at people. I smiled slightly. Funny how that works. Behind us, construction workers were finishing the new house. Bigger. Stronger. My daughter ran across the yard laughing with a small American flag she found during the cleanup. Mike looked at the new porch. Nice upgrade. Insurance helped, I said. He sipped his coffee. Still crazy though. HOA president burns down a judge's house. I leaned against the truck and looked at the land around us. The same land my grandfather bought 50 years ago. The land Karen tried to take. The land Halbrook tried to erase. Mike shook his head. You know what the real lesson is here? What? He grinned. Don't mess with the quiet guy on the street. I laughed. My daughter ran up and grabbed my hand again. Daddy, is Karen coming back? I looked down at her. No. I said gently. Why'd? I looked across the street one last time. Because some people learn the hard way. Mike raised an eyebrow. That the person they tried to push around. I finished the sentence while watching the workers place the final beam on the new house. Was the wrong person to judge.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories.